handbag. Ancient Sumerians were more than familiar with handbags, or perhaps objects that modern people perceive as such.
Archaeologists have uncovered golden cups, royal statues, buried temples, and entire palaces from the ancient world. But after nearly 2 centuries of excavation, one strange object remains impossible to explain. It appears again and again in ancient carvings, held carefully in the hands of mysterious winged beings. A small object that looks unmistakably like a handbag. But here's where the mystery gets even stranger. These aren't handbags at all. In Mesopotamia, scholars generally interpret them as ritual containers or buckets, yet their shape, symbolism, and remarkable appearance across distant civilizations have sparked one of archaeology's most enduring questions. Why did ancient people repeatedly carve this peculiar object into sacred scenes? And what did they believe it represented? And if you think the mystery ends in Mesopotamia, it doesn't. A strikingly similar symbol appears thousands of miles away, in prehistoric Turkey, and even in ancient Mexico, separated by oceans, vast distances, and thousands of years. Were these cultures simply depicting similar ritual objects by coincidence? Was the container connected to purification, fertility, divine power, or some forgotten ceremony? Or are we looking at a symbol whose meaning has been misunderstood for generations? Before we uncover where this mysterious object came from and why it appears in the hands of supernatural beings, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The story begins not in the great cities of Mesopotamia, but in the dust of prehistoric Turkey, at a place called Gobleki Tepe. Built around 9600 BCE, this extraordinary site predates the Great Pyramids by roughly 7,000 years. Its builders lived in a world before writing, before metal tools, before the wheel, and before agriculture had transformed human civilization. They were hunter-gatherers, yet somehow they organized enormous communities capable of quarrying, transporting, raising, and carving stone pillars weighing many tons. And among those mysterious pillars are some of the earliest clues to the strange symbol that would later appear across the ancient world. And here, carved onto massive T-shaped stone pillars among stylized animals, we see it, the handbag. Clear as day, its presence here is a profound riddle from the very dawn of civilization. For the people who built Göbekli Tepe, this strange symbol was part of a visual language whose meaning has been lost to time. Yet thousands of years later, an almost eerily familiar shape would appear again in a completely different civilization. The mystery deepens when we leave prehistoric Turkey behind and travel forward through thousands of years of human history to the place we often call the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, the ancient land of Sumer, Assyria, and Babylon. Here, from roughly 2500 to 700 BCE, the image appears with remarkable frequency, but this time it is no longer an isolated shape carved among animals. Instead, it is placed directly into scenes of ritual and power, held carefully in the hands of imposing winged beings known as the Apkallu, semi-divine sages who were believed to stand between the human and divine worlds. Carved with extraordinary detail into the walls of royal palaces, these figures transform the mysterious object from a strange prehistoric symbol into something that appears deliberate, sacred, and deeply connected to the religious beliefs of Mesopotamia. But just when the mystery seems to be confined to the ancient Near East, the trail suddenly takes us thousands of miles away. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the humid lowlands of ancient Mexico, another civilization was developing its own elaborate artistic and religious traditions, and there, against all expectations, the same basic shape appears again. Around 900 to 400 BCE, the Olmec created monuments filled with powerful figures, supernatural beings, and symbols whose meanings remain debated today. Among the most famous is a carving from La Venta, where a figure, possibly a ruler or ritual specialist, appears to emerge from the jaws of a great serpent. Yet, it is the object held in his hand that immediately catches the eye. A rectangular, pouch-like form with a curved handle, strikingly similar to the mysterious object carried by the Mesopotamian Apkallu. The resemblance is difficult to dismiss at first glance, and it raises a question that seems almost impossible to answer. Why would an object with such a distinctive shape appear in civilizations separated not only by the Atlantic Ocean, but also by thousands of years of history? And the mystery does not end there, because echoes of similar forms have been proposed in later Persian art at magnificent sites such as Persepolis, while some researchers have pointed toward visual parallels in artifacts associated with the Minoans of Crete and the Indus Valley civilization. Each example comes with its own cultural context and its own uncertainties, but together they create a pattern that refuses to disappear completely. So where do we begin when a mystery stretches across continents and thousands of years? The only sensible place is the civilization, where the symbol is most frequently depicted, and where written records give us the best chance of understanding what ancient people themselves believed it meant. That journey takes us into the deserts and river valleys of the ancient Middle East, into Mesopotamia, where the mysterious object appears not once or twice, but again and again in some of the most important royal and religious imagery ever carved. Here, the first step toward solving the mystery is not to examine the object itself, but the beings who carry it, because the people holding these strange objects were anything but ordinary. They were the Apkallu, supernatural figures associated with divine wisdom, protection, and the preservation of civilization. One famous relief, dating to around 870 BCE, shows the type of figure that would become central to this mystery. An imposing supernatural being with an otherworldly appearance, sometimes portrayed with magnificent wings, and sometimes with the head or features of an eagle. Ancient Mesopotamian traditions described the Apkallu as wise beings connected to the gods, intermediaries who brought divine knowledge and the principles of civilization to humanity. Their appearance in royal palaces was therefore not simply artistic decoration. They represented supernatural protection and the sacred authority that surrounded the king and his kingdom. And then we notice something that appears again and again. The Apkallu are almost never empty-handed. In one hand, they carry a strange, pine cone-shaped object, while in the other they hold the very object that has created this mystery, the so-called handbag. The pairing is remarkably consistent, almost as if these supernatural guardians were following a standard ritual procedure. That detail becomes crucial because it suggests that the meaning of the mysterious container cannot be separated from the object beside it or from the ritual being performed. When British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the Assyrian city of Nimrud in 1845, he uncovered palace walls covered with these extraordinary winged figures, each carrying the same distinctive combination of objects. At the time, the meaning of these images was far from clear, and Layard referred to them as mystic emblems, essentially acknowledging that the ancient artists had left behind something that modern archaeologists could see, but not yet understand. Similar scenes were later uncovered at Khorsabad and Nineveh, revealing that this was not an isolated artistic tradition confined to a single palace. The same figures, the same objects, and the same ritual-like compositions appeared across the Assyrian world, suggesting that whatever these symbols represented, They were deeply embedded in the religious and political culture of the time. Yet the real breakthrough did not come from another excavation. It came from learning how to read the words of the people who created these images. Mesopotamia had produced one of the earliest sophisticated writing systems in human history. Cuneiform, the distinctive wedge-shaped script impressed into clay tablets. As scholars gradually deciphered the script and began reading thousands of surviving texts, the world behind the palace carvings started to become clearer. Suddenly, archaeologists were no longer forced to rely entirely on visual interpretation. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves had left behind descriptions of their rituals, their gods, their purification ceremonies, and the objects used in those ceremonies. The mystery surrounding the winged figures and their strange belongings could finally be approached through the written evidence of the civilization that had created them. What had once appeared to be an inexplicable symbol carved into palace walls was beginning to look like part of a carefully structured ritual tradition, and the answer hidden in those ancient texts would fundamentally change the way the mysterious handbag was understood. The winged figures were indeed the Apkallu, just as suspected, but now the objects in their hands had names, and those names gave archaeologists the first real clue to what the mysterious imagery was meant to represent. The pine cone was called the mulilu, while the so-called handbag was known as the bandudu. Suddenly, these objects no longer looked like mysterious magical artifacts from an unknown world. They appeared to be practical tools used for a very specific and well-documented purpose. The bandudu was understood as a bucket, while the mulilu was a ritual implement, most likely a cone made from a date palm. Together, these two objects formed part of a sacred ceremony of purification and consecration, a ritual designed not merely to clean a person or a place, but to establish a connection between the earthly world and the divine forces that ancient Mesopotamians believed governed it. Now imagine the scene unfolding inside an ancient royal palace. An Apkallu stands beside the king, holding the bandudu in one hand and the mulilu in the other. The bucket is filled with sacred water, perhaps enhanced with oils, flour, or other substances that gave it additional ritual significance. The Apkallu dips the cone into the liquid and then raises it, sprinkling the sacred water over the king or toward a revered symbol, such as the sacred tree of life. The movement is simple, but its meaning is profound. Cuneiform texts describe purification rituals in which holy water was used to cleanse sacred spaces and drive away harmful forces, giving us a glimpse into the ceremony that may lie behind the palace reliefs. For the people who created these images, this was not ordinary cleaning. It was a spiritual act through which divine protection could be invoked, evil could be repelled, and the stability of the kingdom could be maintained. The king, purified through the ritual, was symbolically strengthened and legitimized, reinforcing the belief that his authority was connected to the divine order itself. And this is where the palace carvings become much more than beautiful works of ancient art. The figures of the Apkallu, frozen forever in the act of performing the ritual, may have been intended to continue that sacred action long after the original ceremony had ended. Every time someone entered the palace and passed the reliefs, the supernatural guardians were still there, still holding their sacred tools, still sprinkling the symbolic water, and still protecting the royal space. The ritual had effectively been transformed into a permanent image embedded directly into the walls of the palace. In this interpretation, the carvings were not merely showing what had happened in the past, they were symbolically making the ritual happen again and again. The palace itself became part of the protective ceremony, with the Apkallu acting as eternal guardians against chaos and disorder. The mysterious handbag, therefore, was no longer simply an unexplained object. It had become part of a much larger religious system in which purification, divine wisdom, royal authority, and cosmic order were all connected. So, after centuries of speculation, what is the verdict? According to the mainstream interpretation of the Mesopotamian evidence, the mysterious handbag is best understood as the bandudu, a ritual bucket used alongside the mulilu during ceremonies of purification and consecration. Within its Mesopotamian context, the mystery appears to have been solved. The strange rectangular object held by the winged Apkallu was not an advanced device, a portal, or an artifact from some unknown civilization. It was a ritual implement belonging to a very specific religious tradition. But just when the case seems closed, the answer creates an even bigger problem. If the bandudu was simply a Mesopotamian ritual bucket, why does a remarkably similar form appear in places that had no known connection to Mesopotamia? Why does a similar symbol appear in ancient Mexico, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why does a comparable shape appear at Gobleki Tepe thousands of years before the Assyrians even existed? The explanation may solve the local mystery, but it seems to open the door to a much larger one. The power of symbolism. If the bandudu was a real physical object used in important ceremonies, then another question naturally follows. Where are the actual objects? Archaeologists have excavated ancient Mesopotamian cities for generations, uncovering an extraordinary collection of artifacts that survived from this lost world. They have found golden cups, elaborate jewelry, clay vessels, stone tablets, weapons, tools, and countless objects connected to everyday life and religious practice. Yet, the distinctive bandudu seen so frequently in the palace reliefs has not been identified with the same level of certainty as a surviving physical artifact. There is no famous archaeological collection filled with examples of these mysterious containers waiting to be displayed in a museum. No perfectly preserved bandudu has emerged to settle the question once and for all. That absence creates an intriguing gap between the world depicted on the palace walls and the physical evidence left behind in the ground, although the absence of surviving examples does not necessarily mean the objects never existed. There is a simple explanation for that gap. The bandudu may have been made from materials that were never likely to survive thousands of years in recognizable form. A container could have been woven from reeds, fashioned from leather, wood, or other organic materials, and eventually disappear as those materials decayed. Even an object made from a more valuable substance could have been destroyed and repurposed long ago. Gold and silver objects, for example, could easily have been melted down and transformed into something completely different, leaving no obvious trace of their original shape. If the bandudu was primarily a practical ritual container rather than a prestigious object designed to survive for eternity, there may have been little reason for ancient people to preserve it once it had served its purpose. In that sense, the archaeological silence surrounding the object may be perfectly ordinary. The strange thing is not necessarily that the physical containers have disappeared, but that their distinctive form appears so consistently in monumental art. And that observation leads to a second possibility, one that changes the mystery completely. What if the carved handbag was never intended to be a literal, photorealistic representation of one specific bucket? What if the artists were depicting an idea rather than an individual object? Look closely at the scenes in which the bandudu appears, and another symbol often stands nearby, the sacred tree of life. Yet this tree does not resemble an ordinary tree growing in the landscape. It is highly stylized, symmetrical, and deliberately constructed according to a visual formula. No one expects it to be a botanical illustration of a particular species. Instead, it functions as a symbol, communicating a religious concept through a recognizable visual form. Assyriologists commonly refer to it as the sacred tree, and its importance comes from what it represents rather than from whether such a tree ever existed in the physical world. If the sacred tree could function as an image representing an idea, perhaps the bandudu could do the same. Perhaps the object became a form of visual shorthand within Mesopotamian art, instantly communicating ritual purification, sacred power, protection, or divine knowledge to anyone familiar with the symbolic language of the culture. In that interpretation, the shape did not need to be an exact representation of a bucket sitting somewhere inside the palace. Its purpose was to communicate meaning. Much like a modern symbol can represent an entire concept, without depicting every detail of that concept, the bandudu may have become a visual sign whose power came from what people understood it to mean. And if that is true, then the mystery becomes far more interesting, because we are no longer asking how one physical bucket could have traveled from one civilization to another. We are asking how similar ideas could emerge in cultures separated by enormous distances and vast stretches of time. The bandudu may have functioned in much the same way. Rather than being merely a physical container, it could have become a piece of iconographic shorthand, a recognizable symbol within the visual language of Assyrian art. To someone living in that world, the distinctive shape may have immediately communicated ideas of ritual purification, divine protection, sacred wisdom, or the maintenance of cosmic order. In that sense, it was almost like a visual logo for a much larger religious concept. We see something similar in the modern world when a Red Cross symbol immediately suggests medical aid, without needing to show us an actual hospital, or when a heart shape represents love, even though it bears little resemblance to the anatomical human heart. The bandudu, in this interpretation, was not important because of the physical object itself. It was important because of what the image meant. And this is where the real power of the symbol begins to emerge. The palace carvings may have been designed to do far more than simply decorate the walls. Scholars of Mesopotamian art have argued that these monumental images could have had a performative function, meaning that the carvings were not simply records of religious rituals, but were themselves intended to participate symbolically in those rituals. Imagine walking through an Assyrian palace and seeing the Apkallu repeated across the walls, each supernatural guardian frozen in the same sacred act, holding the ritual container and preparing to sprinkle its contents. The ceremony never ends. There is no final moment in which the guardian puts down the bucket and walks away. The image remains there permanently, transforming a temporary ritual into something eternal. Every time the king, a priest, a visitor, or an official passed through the palace, the symbolic purification was still taking place. The walls themselves became part of the protective system. In this interpretation, the palace was surrounded by a continuous loop of divine protection, a symbolic shield against the forces of chaos that ancient Mesopotamians believed threatened the stability of the human world. The Apkallu stood as eternal guardians, while the bandudu became one of the essential elements in this never-ending cosmic performance. The object represented purification, protection, and the transmission of sacred power, while the entire scene reinforced the idea that the king's authority was sanctioned by the divine world. The meaning, therefore, went far beyond the physical shape of a bucket. Its power was not necessarily in the material from which it was made, but in the message encoded into its image. Anyone who understood the visual language would recognize that this was a sacred space, a protected royal environment connected directly to the gods and maintained through ritual order. That interpretation appears to solve the mystery within Mesopotamia itself, But strangely enough, solving the local mystery makes the larger global mystery even harder to explain. If the bandudu was ultimately a symbolic representation of sacred power rather than simply a practical container, then we no longer need to imagine a physical bucket traveling from one civilization to another. Instead, we are confronted with a much more fascinating question. How could a similar idea, expressed through such a distinctive visual form, appear among people who lived thousands of years apart and had no known connection with one another? How could different societies, separated by enormous distances and completely different histories, arrive at imagery that looks so remarkably familiar? That question takes us away from the palaces of Assyria and back into a world far older than the civilizations that eventually rose in Mesopotamia. The Gobleki Tepe anomaly. To understand the full mystery, we have to travel backward through time, not merely by a few centuries but by thousands of years, until we reach a period when cities, writing, metal tools, and even widespread agriculture had not yet transformed human society. In southeastern Turkey, rising from the landscape is an archaeological site unlike almost anything else on Earth, Göbekli Tepe. The name is often translated as Potbelly Hill, but its significance is far greater than its unusual name suggests. The monumental structures found here date back to around 9600 BCE, placing them at the very beginning of the Neolithic period and thousands of years before the rise of the great civilizations of Mesopotamia. The people who built these structures lived in a world of hunter-gatherers, long before the appearance of writing and long before the construction of Egypt's pyramids. Stonehenge would not appear for thousands of years, and the first great cities of Mesopotamia were still unimaginably distant in the future. For generations, the traditional story of civilization seemed straightforward. Humans first learned to farm, then settled permanently in one place, produced food surpluses, developed larger communities, and eventually gained the time and resources necessary to construct monumental architecture and complex religious institutions. Göbekli Tepe forced archaeologists to reconsider parts of that sequence. Here was evidence of enormous communal construction appearing at a time when people were still largely living as hunter-gatherers. Massive stone pillars had been quarried, transported, shaped, and carefully arranged into monumental enclosures, suggesting levels of organization and cooperation that challenged older assumptions about what early human societies were capable of achieving. That is why Göbekli Tepe became one of the most exciting archaeological discoveries of the modern era. It revealed a prehistoric society capable of creating monumental architecture long before the civilizations traditionally associated with the birth of complex society had emerged. And then, among the towering T-shaped pillars and their extraordinary carvings of animals, another detail enters the story. There, alongside images of foxes, birds, scorpions, snakes, and other creatures, researchers have identified a distinctive shape that resembles the same mysterious handbag-like form seen thousands of years later in Mesopotamian art. At first glance, the resemblance is striking, but the context could hardly be more different. There are no Assyrian kings, no royal palaces, and no winged Apkallu performing purification rituals. The people who carved these stones belonged to a completely different world, separated from the Assyrian civilization by thousands of years. Whatever the symbol meant at Göbekli Tepe, it could not simply be assumed to carry the same meaning that it later acquired in Assyria. Yet its presence raises an extraordinary possibility. Perhaps the shape represents something far more ancient than the Mesopotamian ritual tradition itself, something that later cultures independently adapted into their own religious visual languages.